in the early morning following Georgia's national championship celebration. Now, the updated report stated that Carter had misled police about where he was when the crash occurred. He initially told police that he was a mile away from the accident, but is now saying that he was actually alongside the car when it crashed. The police report revealed that Carter and LeCroy were racing at the time of the accident, and LeCroy's blood alcohol concentration was more than twice the legal limit. About an hour after the story's release, police issued an arrest warrant and later charged Carter with reckless driving and street racing. Carter was at the Combine in Indy today undergoing medical testing and was scheduled to speak with reporters when this news dropped, but he is now headed back to Athens. Carter releasing a statement just a few hours ago saying, quote, "This morning I received a telephone call from the Athens, Georgia Police Department informing me that 2 misdemeanor warrants have been issued against me for reckless driving and racing. Numerous media reports also have circulated this morning containing inaccurate information concerning the tragic events of January 5th, 2023. It is my intention to return to Athens to answer the misdemeanor charges against me and to make certain that the complete and accurate truth is represented. There is no question in my mind that when all of the facts are known, that I will be fully exonerated of any criminal wrongdoing." Now, it wasn't until today, guys, that we even learned of any sort of involvement from Jalen Carter in this situation. And of course, the story is still ongoing. But as I said, he was charged with 2 misdemeanors. But what was not addressed, though, is the misleading of police and fleeing the scene. So what are the legal implications here?
It's a really interesting and tragic case, as Emily noted here, right? So misleading police may or may not be something that they could elect to look at. I don't think Jalen Carter really had any choice but to change his story, given the amount of video that the police apparently have on this, collected from city cameras and also cameras of private businesses. If you read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution report, they have a pretty detailed outline of where both Carter's truck and the truck driven by the Georgia recruiting staffer were as they weaved in and out of traffic into oncoming traffic down the center lane at speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. So I don't really know if he had any choice but to change his story. As far as leaving the scene of the accident, I think that really comes down to what your definition of the accident and the scene is. The police initially labeled this as a single car accident. The AJC's report says that Carter's vehicle had basically scuff marks on it from the power lines that fell following the single car accident. So if you defined Carter as being involved in that accident, which obviously wouldn't make it a single car accident, you have multiple cars involved there, then maybe technically you could bring in leaving the scene of that accident. We also don't know if Carter was drinking. We know that they were all leaving the strip club there, but there are a lot of additional questions here that will have to be answered before any additional charges, whether that is leaving the scene, misleading police, or even up to like a vehicular homicide type charge could be filed. We still need some more information on this.
Unfortunate situation. Obviously, lives are lost, and as the evidence keeps mounting and keeps coming out, it looks worse and worse. You're talking about racing. You're talking about alcohol being involved. You're talking about just the decisions that were made, in this situation, not being a good deal for anybody involved. Obviously, from a legal standpoint, what is Jalen Carter's responsibility to that? Bud, you being a former attorney, you're more apt to speak on that than me. But it's an unfortunate situation. It's something that hurts a lot of people. I know we'll talk a lot today about NFL stock and how it's going to affect future, but we do have to recognize that 2 people's lives were lost in this thing, and it's a bad deal all the way around. And it comes back to decision making, because this is something that could have been avoided just by people making better choices in the moment.
And Carl, you mentioned it. Obviously, we love anytime Bud is able to be on the show to talk about college football, but you do have a legal background as well. So I'm curious, are there any legal implications as it pertains to the University of Georgia? You mentioned the car and the situation there.
Sure. So the car, this is sort of important for liability. It was driven by a Georgia staffer. They were out partying and it is a Georgia leased vehicle. So, from a civil standpoint, certainly that will increase the university's involvement when it comes to civil liability. I don't know if any lawsuits have been filed yet on this, but they almost certainly will be. They almost always are in tragic cases like this. I think it's important to note that I'm fairly certain here that the car that Carter was driving was not a university vehicle. I think it was a private vehicle that he was also in when he was cited for driving 89 in a 45 back in September, which is just conveniently 1 mile an hour under the legal limit of 40, or double the speed limit of 45.
But for people like me who don't understand the difference, what difference does it make who owned the car in this situation? The car that the Georgia staffer was driving or Jalen Carter's car, how would that have a difference on the legal ramifications depending on who the owner of the vehicle was?
So from a criminal standpoint, basically none, right? From a civil standpoint, it basically brings it in more of you're claiming, hey, this is an extension of Georgia's actions as an athletic department. It's a university employee driving a university car, partying with the players. It kind of ropes them in a little bit more, establishes that legal nexus if you're looking to go after Georgia.
Gotcha. Thank you for the clarification with that. And we were chatting a little bit before the show began on, the precedent and how much we've, seen this potentially impact his draft stock. And we'll get into that in just a little bit with bringing in an NFL draft analyst. We'll also head to Athens to talk to somebody there at Georgia to hear if there are any updates on that situation. But Bud, you referenced it. This is not the first time that Jalen Carter has been implicated in something involving, a vehicle. Also not the first time a Georgia player has gotten in trouble for racing this season. Is there any sort of issue there that needs to be addressed within the Georgia program?
I don't know if there is necessarily an issue, like a pervasive issue, but you have Dumas Johnson, one of their star linebackers, getting cited for racing just 5 days ago for an incident that happened 5 days prior to the crash. You have Jalen Carter doing almost double the speed limit of 45 back in September, and then you have this tragic racing incident that ended in death. And these are young guys; they feel invincible, and I'd like to hear Carl's thoughts on this, obviously. But if I'm Kirby Smart, we're done with the racing guys. Like that has got to end now. That's too dangerous to be doing down. And this is, if you pull up Google Maps, this is down like a residential street with a lot of curbs. I mean, this is not on a highway that they're doing this.
When you're coaching guys, and I'm sure when you're in Kirby Smart situation, you're talking to guys about every possible thing that can go wrong: alcohol, speeding, academics, guns, girls, any single thing in the world that can happen that can negatively impact you, that can negatively impact the program. Ultimately, those guys are going to leave the locker room, they're going to leave the meeting rooms, and decisions are going to have to be made. And so, does the responsibility of that fall on the coach? That's always the first question when a player gets in trouble. Is there a problem in the program? Is there a discipline problem? I think that Kirby Smart is probably one of the most thorough people that there is about holding his guys accountable. This is an unfortunate situation, but it's also a situation that a couple of individuals made on their own. So I think that Kirby has went over that. I'm sure he'll go over it again. They're going to have team meetings. I'm sure they've had grief counselors come in. But the overlaying thing is, as a coach, how much power do you really have over the decisions that everybody in your programs makes? The players, the coaches, etc. And that, like I said earlier, it's an unfortunate situation. But I think that everything that you would want your players to do, or the way that you want them to behave, I'm sure that those things are gone over time and time again. And you hope as a coach that they make the right decisions. But you also know that there's going to be times that you get a phone call and you're going to have to deal with a situation that's unfortunate. It happens to every single coach. And you wish that there was a way to solve the problem, but there never has been.
I agree with that. And look, this shouldn't be blamed on Kirby Smart in any way. When you make the $10 million a year, you are going to be imputed some of that, right? And they're going to say, hey, like, you need to get your team to act better. I don't know if that's totally fair. I do think though, like Carl mentioned, hey, you're going to talk about women, you're going to talk about drugs, you're going to talk about guns, you're going to talk about driving. I don't know, like, do you have a specific bullet point in your outline of your preseason talk with your team about racing? To me, that wouldn't necessarily be something that comes up. It's just, hey, I got to make sure to tell these guys, don't race each other at 100 mile an hour down the wrong way on residential streets. But like, I think if you're Kirby, that probably just needs to be extra outlined, guys. Like this is more dangerous than you might think it is. You're not quite as in control of these cars as you think that you might be. And Carl's right. If you count the walk-ons, 100+ dudes in that locker room, you're not going to be able to control what they all do. It is a kind of a large number of racing or super speeder, as Georgia statute defines it, type incidents within the last quarter year.
When you talk about the racing, as an individual thing, I think that you do have to go over just driving safety, period, for kids. That for young people that drive, because young people are they are most likely to speed. They are most likely to take those kind of chances and do those kind of things. So it is something that you have to cover. And it's another thing. I bet you everybody in the country now is going to be talking to their team tomorrow about how you drive. I've had situations as a high school coach where I've had a parent come in because one of my players got a ticket driving 91 miles an hour. And so it's something and I don't think he was racing anybody. He was just driving extremely fast on the interstate. And that can end up in a really, really bad situation. And I know that we talked to him. I know that we made him run. I know that we did all the things that you're supposed to do to try to change his behavior. But I can tell you what, 3 days later, he got a ticket for going 89 miles an hour. So whose fault is it? Well, at that point, him being a high school kid, you take the car. But what are we really talking about?
Yeah, I mean, Carl, along those lines, this is a unique situation in that Jalen Carter is no longer a Georgia Bulldog. I mean, he's off to the NFL. He's no longer, being coached by Kirby Smart. So, we mentioned this earlier. Optically, it's usually easy to discipline the student athlete or to withhold them from play. You can't do that in this situation. I mean, how much more challenging does it make the job of Kirby Smart in handling this when Jalen Carter is no longer a member of his team? Carl?
Well, there's nothing you can do to Jalen Carter anymore. Jalen Carter is off to the NFL, and he'll deal with the NFL. The only thing that he can do is address his football team moving forward and say, these are my expectations. These are the things that are important for you to play at the University of Georgia, and you have to continue to hone in on them about what's acceptable. And it's not just racing. It's all kind of other things that can happen with a player. Kirby's been around a long time. There's all kind of trouble that you can find yourself into that as a coach you got to go over, and you hope your guys can avoid the landmines.
Totally agree with Carl on that. I think that the one thing, not the reason it should fall back on Kirby Smart, but the reason why it will in the quote unquote media is that if you're racing teammates, it's going to be sort of imputed as a team activity, right? It's, Georgia player racing Georgia player, as appears to have happened again here, right? So from that standpoint, I totally get it. This is hard to control, but if you're Kirby, now that you've had this happen, you basically have to have, you don't want to say zero tolerance, but pretty low tolerance. I do think the lesson he can teach his team is, and we'll get to this in a little bit, if Jalen Carter's draft stock drops, Kirby can circle the amount he would have made if he had gone number one overall, like some of these mock drafts have had him, and how much he actually made when he went wherever he went. And he said, hey, Jalen Carter is a stud. None of y'all could block him in practice, right? Like if it can happen to this guy and he can lose all these millions, it could happen to you. You got to be smart.
I think that you have to look deeper than the draft stock, though, because everybody does that. That's what coaches, we say, well, this guy would have got drafted. This is the amount of money that he's going to lose. Everybody on the University of Georgia, that doesn't apply to, because they're not all NFL guys that are going to play in the NFL. You have to point more towards people are dead. You could be dead. Like the guy driving the other car is dead. You could be in prison for 20 or 30 years. Even if you were not going to play in the league, if you were just going to go get a regular job making $80,000 a year, you'd rather be doing that than be dead. You'd rather be doing that than be serving 30 years in prison for vehicular homicide. Like, you have to talk a little bit deeper because everybody that plays football doesn't want to play in the NFL, and they're not going to the NFL. And a program like Georgia probably has more guys like that that are going to play than aren't. But you have to address all the guys in the room. The right guard that's a walk on that's still on the football team, he's not thinking NFL, but you also have to teach him that he can't get drunk and drive 100 miles an hour also. So I think the NFL piece goes to like 10 or 15% of the football team, but you have to have a message that's going to resonate with every single player in the locker room. And everybody can understand that they don't want to be in prison and they don't want to be in the early grave. And those are realistic things based on the outcome that you have to talk to your football team about.
Really, really good point there, Carl. I just want to clarify, though, Willock was not the driver of the second vehicle. That was Chandler LeCroy, was a passenger, was, a part of the situation as well, but just in the sake of accuracy.